The cameras were rolling, the lights blinding, and millions of eyes fixed on a live broadcast that was supposed to be a routine panel debate. But nothing about this night would remain routine. Because in a moment that stunned the country, Kellyanne Conway, once celebrated for her unshakable poise in hostile interviews, snapped. Her voice rose, sharp and cutting, her words tumbling over one another as she lashed out, not just at the host, but at anyone who dared to challenge her version of reality. The studio felt tense. The host shifted uncomfortably, trying to regain control, but Conway was relentless, her hands slicing the air, her tone dripping with indignation. She wasn't answering questions. She was bulldozing through them, louder and louder, as if sheer volume could transform spin into truth. It wasn't just a defense. It was an explosion. And then, in that same frame, there was Jasmine Crockett, sitting poised, her eyes steady, her posture unshaken. While Conway's fury consumed the stage, Crockett's silence carried more weight than any interruption could. It was the silence of someone who had seen the storm before, who knew that chaos eventually collapses under its own weight. Viewers at home felt it. Social feeds lit up instantly. What's happening to Conway? Why does Crockett look so calm? The clash was no longer just a debate. It had become a theater of contrasts. One voice flailing desperate, unrestrained. The other grounded, deliberate, waiting. And here's the truth. America has seen shouting before. But this wasn't just shouting. This was a meltdown. A seasoned political operative unraveling in real time, lived before the nation. The spectacle was shocking enough. But what made the moment historic was not Conway's collapse. It was what was about to follow. Because Crockett, the rising force many underestimated, had been waiting for her opening. The calm in her expression wasn't passivity. It was precision. And when she finally spoke, her words wouldn't just pierce Conway's rant. They would reset the entire conversation. The country leaned in. The panel froze. And as Conway's voice cracked under its own fury, the stage was cleared for a response that no one in that studio, and no one watching at home, would ever forget. But the question was, what exactly would Jasmine Crockett say? Why did this confrontation matter so much? Because this wasn't just another shouting match on cable news. This was bigger. This was the clash of two Americas, live and unfiltered. On one side stood Kellyanne Conway, a symbol of political spin, a master of distraction who had built her career on bending reality until truth itself seemed negotiable. On the other sat Jasmine Crockett, a woman who represented something Conway could never imitate: authenticity, dignity, and a calm rooted in lived struggle. To many watching, Conway's eruption wasn't surprising. It was a natural outburst of a political class that had grown too comfortable, too arrogant, too sure that power could shield them from accountability. But Crockett's presence raised the stakes. She was younger, sharper, and unafraid to confront the bluster with facts. And more than that, she carried the voices of those often drowned out immigrants, working people, communities who rarely see themselves defended on primetime television. The tension wasn't just about who would win the argument. It was about who would define the narrative of the moment. Would it be another night where noise overpowered truth? Or would dignity finally silence chaos? The studio lights seemed hotter, the pauses longer, as though even the camera's new history was tilting. Viewers could feel the weight. For Conway, this was about clinging to relevance, keeping her grip on an audience that once saw her as untouchable. For Crockett, it was about showing America that calm courage could stand taller than arrogance, that you don't need to shout to shatter a lie. And as Conway ranted louder, Crockett's quiet strength only amplified the contrast. The louder the villain grew, the more powerful the hero appeared in her silence. Social feeds didn't just notice. They exploded with anticipation. Everyone was waiting for the moment when Crockett would finally unleash the words that would turn Conway's explosion into her undoing. Because in debates like this, volume might dominate the minute, but truth echoes far longer. And Crockett was about to prove that in the most unforgettable way. But first, the storm had to reach its peak. To understand why Kellyanne Conway's eruption shook the airwaves, you have to understand the playbook she carried into every studio. For years, Conway perfected the art of distraction. She was the architect of alternative facts, the master of turning pointed questions into winding monologues that led nowhere but confusion. Her weapon wasn't truth. It was distortion, delivered with a smile that dared you to challenge her. She built her reputation on outmaneuvering hosts, cutting off challengers, and spinning contradictions into sound bites that could survive a news cycle. To her supporters, she was untouchable, a sharp strategist who could fend off attacks with sheer verbal agility. But beneath that veneer was always a dangerous fragility, a reliance on noise to cover the cracks. The cracks widened over time. Each outburst, each dodge, each moment of arrogance chipped away at the myth of control she had so carefully crafted. By the time she stepped into this debate, the nation wasn't watching with awe. It was watching with skepticism. The old tactics weren't working. The world had changed. And Conway's tone, once seen as confident, now came off as defensive, bitter, desperate. That's why the meltdown felt inevitable. Conway had been walking a tightrope for years, balancing spin against reality, confidence against collapse. And this night, under the glare of live television, the rope finally snapped. Her shouting wasn't strength. It was the sound of someone who had run out of tricks. But here's the twist. Conway didn't know she had already lost, because across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, who wasn't playing by the old rules. She wasn't going to be shouted down, tangled in spin, or dragged into the noise. She was there to expose it. And so, while Conway erupted with the fury of a cornered figure, Crockett sat steady. The contrast wasn't just personal. It was generational. One represented the old guard clinging to a vanishing playbook. The other embodied the rising force that would no longer tolerate chaos masquerading as power. Conway's unraveling was more than a meltdown. It was the crumbling of a political persona. And Crockett was about to deliver the final push. While Conway's story was built on spin, Jasmine Crockett's story was built on struggle. Her composure on that studio stage didn't come from media training. It came from a life where she had to fight, often quietly, to be heard. Born without the luxury of connections, Crockett's journey into politics wasn't written by privilege. It was carved through grit, sacrifice, and the relentless belief that truth and justice still mattered in a system that too often rewarded the opposite. She began her career as a public servant, not for glory, but for necessity. She defended the vulnerable, the voiceless, the people who couldn't afford high-powered attorneys or flashy lobbyists. Every courtroom, every case, every long night poured into those who had no one else to stand for them. That kind of work leaves its mark. It builds a steel spine that no amount of shouting can bend. And when she entered the political arena, Crockett didn't leave that fight behind. She carried it with her. She spoke for communities ignored by those in power, calling out inequality with precision, and refusing to soften her words for the comfort of the privileged. For some, she was too blunt. For others, she was exactly what they had been waiting for. A leader who wasn't afraid to tell the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made the room. That's what made this clash with Conway so symbolic. Crockett represented a new kind of voice, one rooted in reality, in lived pain, in dignity that could not be rattled by insults. She wasn't a career spin doctor. She was a woman forged in real battles, carrying scars that became her strength. Her calm in that studio wasn't passivity. It was strategy. She had faced louder storms than Conway's tirade. She had seen injustice far more brutal than raised voices on live TV. And because of that, she knew the value of patience. She knew that sometimes the most devastating answer isn't the quickest. It's the one delivered with precision after the noise has worn itself out. To the audience, her silence during Conway's eruption wasn't weakness. It was power. It was a kind of silence that said, I'm not afraid of your volume. I'm waiting for the moment to end you with truth. And that's exactly what she was about to do. Crockett's rise wasn't an accident. It was a reckoning. She wasn't there to trade insults. She was there to redefine what leadership looks like. And when her turn to speak came, it wouldn't just be a rebuttal. It would be a statement. A statement for everyone who had ever been talked over, shouted down, or dismissed. And as Conway's fury reached its peak, Crockett's calm began to glow brighter. Because the louder the villain screamed, the more inevitable the hero's words became. What happened next would turn silence into thunder. The debate had reached a fever pitch. Conway, flushed and unrestrained, dominated the airwaves with interruptions and raised tones, cutting across the host, the panel, anyone who dared to enter the conversation. She wasn't debating. She was drowning the room in noise, as if volume alone could substitute for evidence. Each sentence was less about substance and more about survival. But across from her, Jasmine Crockett remained unmoved. She didn't flinch at the jabs, didn't roll her eyes or raise her voice. Instead, she let Conway's chaos spill over, refusing to compete with it. The effect was striking. While Conway shouted, Crockett's silence became louder than words. The audience watching at home could feel the imbalance, one figure spiraling, the other radiating control. The host tried to intervene, fumbling to restore order, but Conway pressed harder. She gestured wildly, her voice cracking with urgency. "This is the truth, and you all know it," she shouted, her fingers stabbing the air. But truth wasn't on her side. It never had been. And the more she insisted, the clearer the contrast became. Crockett finally leaned forward, her expression calm, her voice steady as she prepared to speak. But she didn't rush. She didn't fight to cut in. She waited, letting the weight of Conway's meltdown collapse under its own fury. It was the patience of someone who knew that timing could be more devastating than any insult. The tension was unbearable. Viewers could sense it. The sharp intake of breath before the storm breaks, the moment when composure transforms into power. Conway's explosion had burned bright, but now it was sputtering. Her words, once sharp, began to blur into noise, and in that thinning space, Crockett's presence loomed larger. And then Crockett opened her mouth. The first words were measured, deliberate, carrying the kind of force that doesn't need shouting. It was a calm before the thunderclap. The precision of a counterattack crafted not in anger, but in clarity. The studio froze. The audience at home leaned closer, because everyone knew this was the moment. The meltdown had played out, the storm had peaked, and now Jasmine Crockett was about to deliver the blow that would echo far beyond the walls of that studio. And what came out of her mouth next would change everything. When Jasmine Crockett finally spoke, it wasn't with fury or volume. It was with precision. Her voice was low, steady, almost surgical in its calm, slicing clean to the chaos Conway had unleashed. She didn't need to shout. Every word carried the kind of authority that makes an audience lean in, afraid to miss a syllable. She began by dismantling Conway's claim point by point, not in broad strokes, but in exacting detail. Facts laid out like evidence in a courtroom, each one slamming shut another door Conway had tried to pry open. She exposed the contradictions, the distortions, the deliberate distractions, and did it without raising her tone above conversation level. That restraint itself became devastating. Conway tried to cut in, but Crockett refused to give her oxygen. With a simple hand raised slightly and a voice unwavering, she pressed forward. "You've made a career shouting over people, Kellyanne," she said, her eyes locked in with quiet fire. "But shouting doesn't make something true. Facts do. And the fact is, what you just said crumbles under the weight of reality." The studio erupted in murmurs. The host leaned back, visibly relieved that someone had finally anchored the storm. Social media, already buzzing, lit up like wildfire. Clips of that single line were being cut, captioned, and shared in real time. But Crockett wasn't finished. She leaned in further, her tone still calm, but her words gathering force. She reframed the moment, moving beyond the clash to what it symbolized. This isn't about me versus you. This is about whether America values chaos or clarity, arrogance or accountability. And if you think yelling is going to change that, well, this moment just proved otherwise. Silence followed. Real silence. Conway, for once, had no comeback. Her explosion had left her spent, and Crockett's mic drop response had turned that noise into nothing more than background static. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone in that studio, and everyone watching at home, knew it. But the shock waves wouldn't stay contained in that room. They were about to ripple far beyond, reshaping conversations across the country. The clips spread like wildfire. Within minutes, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram were ablaze with Crockett's calm takedown. Hashtags trended worldwide. Hashtag Crockett clapback. Hashtag truth over spin. Hashtag Conway meltdown. Memes poured in, showing Conway's fiery outburst side by side with Crockett's unshakable calm. Commentators rushed to weigh in. Some framed it as the ultimate clash between spin and truth. Others called it the beginning of a new era, where composure and clarity finally outshine noise. Even celebrities joined the chorus, praising Crockett's strength. That's how you handle chaos. One tweet read, racking up thousands of retweets within an hour. For Conway, the meltdown became a scar that wouldn't fade easily. For Crockett, it was a coronation moment. People who had never heard her name before were suddenly searching for her speeches, following her accounts, quoting her words. She wasn't just part of the debate. She had owned it, reshaped it, and walked away with the nation's attention. The ripple effects went further. Late-night shows picked up the clip. Editorials poured in. And for ordinary viewers, especially those who had been dismissed or shouted down in their own lives, Crockett's response wasn't just satisfying. It was personal. Because this wasn't just a political debate anymore. It was proof that truth, when delivered with dignity, could still silence chaos. And yet, the real power of that moment wasn't what happened on TV. It was a lesson that would linger long after the broadcast ended. In the end, Crockett's calm takedown was more than a victory in the debate. It was a statement about what America values. Loudness may dominate for a moment, but dignity endures. Lies may flood the airwaves, but truth still carries weight when delivered with courage. Her silence before speaking, her composure while answering, her clarity in dismantling chaos. All of it created a blueprint for how to face arrogance. Not with anger, not with shouting, but with unshakable confidence in truth. For millions watching, it wasn't just Crockett winning an argument. It was themselves being validated. It was proof that dignity still matters, that arrogance can collapse, and that justice doesn't need a raised voice to be heard. And that lesson is what turned one viral clip into a cultural moment. And so, the headline will forever read, Kellyanne Conway explodes on live TV. Jasmine Crockett hits back hard. But what history will remember is not the meltdown. It's the mic drop. Crockett's composure reminded the nation that chaos isn't power, and that truth, spoken with courage, can still silence the loudest noise. Her victory wasn't about ego. It wasn't about sound bites. It was about dignity. And in that studio, dignity won. That's why this moment matters to us. Not just as spectators, but as people who want better for our country. Because when someone like Jasmine Crockett stands tall, she's not just speaking for herself. She's speaking for everyone who's ever been talked over, disrespected, or dismissed. She's showing that we don't have to play by the rules of arrogance. We can redefine the game. And that's exactly what we're doing here on Argument Arena. We bring you the clashes, the meltdowns, the turning points, and the lessons hidden inside them. Because these moments aren't just entertainment. They're blueprints for how dignity can triumph in our own lives. So if you felt that spark tonight, if Crockett's courage gave you strength, don't let it stop here. Subscribe, share, and join us. Because together, we'll make sure the truth keeps winning.